Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone. We're glad you can attend Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts webinar. We hope, once again, that everyone is staying safe and staying well. Just a note before we begin, if you've listened to one of our webinars before, you know we offer attendees a certificate of attendance. When the webinar ends, post-event survey will pop up. It will list 3 questions about the quality of the webinar, followed by 3 questions titled, Required for Certificate. If you would like a certificate of attendance emailed to you, you should answer those 3 questions. If you don't want a certificate, well then obviously don't bother answering them. So today's topic, raising teen boys with ADHD is a challenging, confusing, and also loving pursuit. As much as teens want to separate and distance themselves from their parents, they will need their moms and dads to help them achieve that independence. A lot is happening when you think about it in the teen years. School is more complicated, social relationships are more challenging, and hormone levels are increasing. Then there's the major effect of ADHD and possibly comorbid conditions on all these situations. A parent has his or her hands full figuring out how best to support a teen, especially when the last thing the teen wants, it seems, is your support. Thankfully, we have Anne Richey here to help us with these challenges. Anne is a licensed school psychologist in private practice in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, with a special interest in ADHD. She has spoken at national and international conferences on ADHD, executive functioning difficulties, and learning disabilities. She is the co-author of 4 books on ADHD, including Raising Boys with ADHD and the ADHD Empowerment Guide. You can ask questions of Anne during her presentation, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can after she finishes. If you want to download the slides of this webinar, click the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources on the bottom left of your screen. If you do not see the Event Resources tab, you need to refresh the page. That all being said, let's finally get to the webinar. Anne, thanks for being here today to help us figure this very important topic out.
Oh, thanks for the great introduction, Wayne, and setting the stage for what we're going to speak about today. So I'm so happy to have the chance to talk to you about parenting teen boys with ADHD because it's a subject I'm so passionate about because I've seen the difference parents can make in the lives of their son when they have realistic expectations, work as a team in facing the challenges of adolescence, focus on the strengths and shore up the weaknesses. So it's almost like a metamorphosis when boys realize they can work with and around their ADHD to get where they need to be, that ADHD isn't going to stop them. And you're a key person in that process. So the purpose today is not to make your life more difficult, especially during these trying times, by heaping more things on your plate, but to talk about things that you can do in your daily interaction with your son to promote his growth. Like just by being intentional in your parenting, you can make a big difference. So I hope that you're going to find some strategies that you can try on, see if they work for you and your family, probably having to tweak them to fit your individual situation. But hopefully you'll come away with some things that can make a difference for you in this difficult journey. So I want to tell you about Pat, whose journey illustrates the goals that I want to talk to you about. I first met him when he was floundering in elementary school. He'd been diagnosed with ADHD and attentive type, and he was having such a struggle, he was almost at the point of depression. His mom kept saying he was smart, but he wasn't demonstrating that at school. So finally, in 5th grade, a teacher realized that he did have significant academic deficits and wasn't really able to do all that was expected of him. He was diagnosed with a learning disability and received additional academic support. He had a strength in math, So he applied for and was accepted to an engineering magnet that had a lot of hands-on projects. His mom was diligent and very serious about seeing that his IEP was followed. So Pat's motivation started improving with structure and monitoring, and he realized that he had a strength in helping other students with these projects. So he gained a sense of respect he had never had before. So Mom modeled the problem solving by her determination to help him and find solutions to his issues. He realized he had a passion for helping others, so he applied for a high school teaching magnet where he continued having success. He graduated, and now he's a valued part of an aftercare staff at a local elementary and a part-time college student. So he went from floundering to finding his path. So if you have realistic expectations for your son, focus on his strengths, provide supports only when necessary, and help set him up for success, you're going to be doing so much to help him. So before jumping into the strategies, just let's take a quick review of ADHD and the developmental tasks of adolescents. So there are definitely observed differences between boys and girls with ADHD. We know that boys with ADHD often lag behind their peers 2 to 3 years in the development of their cognitive, social, and emotional skills. Girls develop at a faster rate, and that allows them to mitigate some of the problems that come with ADHD. But the good news for boys is that maturation may result in less hyperactivity. I think the restlessness underlying that remains, but they don't have that overt activity level. Girls tend to have more social and internalizing kinds of problems, and research now shows that estrogen makes their journey more difficult. But let's look at just the developmental tasks for boys in general, and Wayne touched on these. But primarily, their job is to separate from parents. And this is quite a difficult task because they need help, but they don't want to accept it. And I saw a title of a book that sort of summed up this struggle. And the title of it was Get Out of My Life, but first, could you drive me and Cheryl to the mall? So they need to separate, but they still need support, not just for silly things like driving them around, but for that connection and that coaching. Boys need to establish a sense of masculinity or some kind of importance that distinguishes them and gives them some credibility with peers. They have to come to terms with a rapidly changing body, and especially now, the demands on their executive functioning skills, those brain-based skills they need to get academic jobs done or any kind of job done, have become more difficult in our quarantine-related education. They have to manage an increasingly complex social environment, which is much more difficult than maybe you or I experienced. And COVID-19 has also probably ramped up the anxieties that they have to deal with about their future. In the neurobiological aspects of ADHD only complicate adolescence. So we know that boys with ADHD have reduced level of the neurotransmitters that impact the communication from different parts of their brain that are needed for the different functions to integrate smoothly. And specifically, there's underactivity in the frontal lobe, where a lot of the more complex thinking takes place. So their attention is often dependent on interest and novelty. And we know that middle and high school curriculums don't normally play to that. Testosterone may increase risk-taking behaviors, which can result in drug use or dangerous behaviors. The deficits in executive functioning that we mentioned earlier have greater consequences as the demands placed on them with more complex curriculums come into play. As we noted, they lag behind their peers cognitively and socially. Sometimes it's important just to stop yourself and think that, even though my son is 15, some of his skills are more like a 12-year-old. And that perspective sometimes is helpful. And one of the hallmarks, I think, of ADHD is they're consistently inconsistent. It's almost like the unexpected is actually to be expected. And as we noted before, there's a higher rate of coexisting disorders. So even though these challenges are daunting sometimes, it's really important to keep the big picture in mind. And think about, at the end of the day, exactly who do you want your son to be? And most of the parents that I've worked with tend to agree that they basically want their son to be a happy, independent adult who contributes to society. And they want to have parented him so that they will be able to maintain a relationship. So, as we talk about the next steps, think about your son and visualize, how you hope he'll be in 5 to 10 years. And sometimes that perspective is helpful. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the importance of having realistic expectations at home, school, and in the community. So this is, can be very difficult, and sometimes it involves giving up on some dreams that you've held on to for some time. But it's important to make sure that they are in line with his capability, because if expectations aren't achievable, that's a recipe for frustration. It's important to try to keep lines of communication open. And during this COVID-19, you probably are spending more time with your son. So in a sense, that's a luxury of time. And try to really listen deeply and understand his communication style and his language. Like, that's a real insight into his mindset. Reachable goals, like we said, are critical, but they also need accountability, because we know they're not great with follow-through, despite maybe having great intentions. Structure and boundaries are critical. He needs you to be the parent. While you want to establish a relationship, you still need to maintain that control, that ability to stand firm with certain structure and certain boundaries. And research is finding that parents especially, are more successful when they focus on the effort that your son puts in rather than just results. If he gives it 100%, then, what more can you expect? So let's break it down and look specifically at realistic expectations at home. And this is going to be very individual. And you might even want to think about this for your own family, and even write down what your family stands for, what their code is. But this is something that one family I worked with came up with. And treating each other with respect was very high on their list. They had 2 teenagers that would constantly get into it with each other. So they had the expectation that they were not going to resort to name calling or cursing. And so they came up with a term for makeup mess up, or mess up makeup, sorry. So if you did, call your sibling a name, then you had to think of something to do to make up for that. And that really worked well for them. They really focused on honesty about people being participants in chores so the family could function. And they wanted to have fun together because they knew when it was all said and done, that's maybe how their relationship would be preserved. So a frequent upset in these realistic expectations, which we've touched on already, is cursing and emotional outbursts. And so many boys with ADHD have a significant problem with this. And I think it's really important to keep in mind the whole neurological profile of ADHD with these ineffective brain connections, which are so important to the self-regulation process. Because when you think about it, self-regulation is really quite a complex process involving, shifting thoughts away from the upsetting event, calling on memory to think of something that's similar that might have happened and how you handle it, and thinking about consequences. And one of the most vivid examples I can think of that points to this explosiveness was a 15-year-old in my first 8th grade classroom that I taught. He clearly had ADHD, but no diagnosis. He had great difficulty focusing, but one particular day he was really taken by one of the assignments, and he was working harder than I'd ever seen him work before. But another child got up and asked him to borrow a pencil, and all of a sudden Johnny jumped up out of his desk, threw it over, and said, "You can't even think around here," laced with lots of expletives, and stormed out of the room. Now, that was clearly inappropriate, and he did have consequences. But later, when he was able to talk about it, he said he was so frustrated that he was working so hard and had just thought up an answer, and then somebody broke his concentration, and he knew he would never get that answer back again. So I think it's important to understand that in order to have this control, these teens have to not only bury the information that or the experience that's floated to the top and become explosive, but they have to, think of how they're going to handle it. It's a more complex process for them. I think it's also important to realize that behavior is often the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot that lies below the surface that may have played into that behavior. The good news is that medication may improve the neurological network and also the control. And the bad news is that current media, culture, and political climate are not serving as good role models. So how can you go about trying to manage these outbursts? One of the most important things is make sure you are modeling control. A very wise father that I worked with knew that he was losing his temper and lecturing his son and getting nowhere with that. So he wrote a P on one finger standing for patience and a U on the other index finger standing for understanding. And every time he started to point his finger at his son, which had almost become automatic for him now, he would see that P or that U, and he would think, I've got to have some patience here and some understanding. And that helped him manage that. It's important to make sure your son has a structured life where he's got plenty of time for physical activity, especially. He's getting proper sleep and proper nutrition, because those all are helpful. He needs to learn to recognize triggers so he can avoid situations that he knows are going to be leading to outbursts. It's important for you as a parent to make sure that your teen does not get what he wants by cursing, because that is only reinforcing the behavior. And so no matter how much effort it takes to dig deep and refrain from giving in to him, you have to think, if I do give in, I'm going to have a more difficult time next time. And I'm sure most of you know that engaging is not helpful. There's little logical thought that is going on when they've lost control, and lots of angry words that maybe shouldn't be said or are going to be said. So it's helpful if you can help your son become disciplined enough to remove himself from a situation before he becomes explosive, and if not, when you can remove yourself, that's advantageous. And when he's calm, you want ultimately him to be able to name his feelings, because that is like a step in starting to control them. Was he angry? Was he embarrassed? Was he hurt? Were his feelings hurt? What was behind it? And then develop alternative strategies. And this will take place over years. This will take a lot of effort and a lot of mistakes to get to the point where he can develop alternative strategies. Helping him keep things in perspective is important. Probably all of us have had our teens say, well, you just ruined my life, or it's never going to be the same. And then the following week, they'll hardly remember what event they referenced then. So perspective is very important. And then if these events are very severe, in their duration or their intensity, you may need outside help in managing it. So there's just a sample conversation. But, it's very individual, but this is just an example of one where the child may be open to talking, but you want to let them know it's okay to be mad, but not okay to curse. Maybe tell them how it impacted you, how you felt about it, how you want, to reach a better way of doing things. And in this particular example, he was angry because the parent wouldn't let him go out and be with his friends during the quarantine, and he was worried about how his friends would perceive him. And so the parent explains, her rationale and why it's important for them to follow community rules, but also identifying and understanding his angry feelings. So these are some strategies that have worked with teams that I've worked with to develop some self-restraint. A lot of them really take some comfort in understanding why ADHD may require them to take some additional steps in getting better control, some time to give that amygdala time to settle down so that, they're in control of what's happening, not giving in to this explosiveness. Some options, and again, he's going to have to pick what works for him, because you really, don't know what might be something that he's willing to use. But it's important to help him recognize early warning signs. And then one very concrete young man that I worked with benefited from just visualizing a big, giant red stop sign in front of his face. And that was like surprising to him, and his cue that I've got to step back here and think about what I'm doing. Some kids benefit from, gradually tensing and relaxing muscles, deep breathing. I find self-talk actually very helpful, where they can just say to themselves, I know I can handle this, or I know I can figure out a way out of this. And one particular boy I worked with found that he never was able to think very well on the spot. And one particular time, a popular boy came up to him and asked if he could borrow his assignment to copy to turn in as his own. And this young man really wanted to be accepted by this popular crowd, and he agreed. But then later he realized that was a really bad mistake. So he had a good relationship with his parents, and he was able to talk it over with them, and they were able to help him resolve it. But he decided in the future, when someone asked him something that just didn't feel right, that he would just say, well, let me think about it, and I'll get back to you. So let's talk about realistic expectations at school. And it's in such a state of flux right now, we're not going to really spend a lot of time on it because things are so stressful for everyone. But basically, you want your son to check in as he's required during this COVID pandemic. You still want him to get acceptable grades. And that's something that you'll decide with noting his skill level, maybe in consultation with his teacher. If he's several years behind in grade, his reading grade level, then, maybe he's not going to be able to get A's and B's. Maybe C's are the best he can do. But you want to figure out what, is reasonable to expect, and then hold firm with that. You want him to complete his work with minimal struggle. It's his work. He's responsible for it. You can provide support, but you're not going to be doing it. And then monitoring grades is an area where he'll likely need your insight, because my experience is that kids tend to think, well, I'll do it tomorrow, and then the end of the period, the grading period comes, and you and he find out he's got like 6 missing assignments, or he's got a huge assignment due tomorrow. So if you can set up some kind of a strategy where he checks his grades and you assist with it, and then hopefully, ultimately, he'll be able to do it on his own. So realistic expectations in the community are also important, and certainly now obeying the community rules, which in most areas involve quarantining. You want him to treat people the way he wants to be treated. And then driving is a very thorny issue for teens and parents. And as a responsible parent, you want him to practice safe driving rules. And remember that driving is a privilege, it's not a right. So if he isn't ready for that, then it's your responsibility to withhold that from him until he is. Dr. Russell Barkley is a researcher who's devoted his life to ADHD, and he's developed an ADHD safe driving program in conjunction with CHAD, and I've given you the link there. And it's very helpful for parents whose teens are getting ready to drive. So I would encourage you to look at that. So now let's talk about identifying the difference between what your son can't do and what he won't do. So you'll have to put on your detective hat and sort of observe him and ask yourself questions. Is he overwhelmed by the scope of the task? If you helped him break the task down into smaller steps, would he be more successful? Has he handled anything similar in the past? Are you sure he has the skill level required? And is anxiety and worry immobilizing him and causing him to be unable to move forward? Once you've, thought about it, see if you can make a list with your son of things that he needs help with and things that he can do independently. And then work on developing as many things as you can turn into habits so they become more automatic. So one particular boy I worked with was very resistant to doing this. So his mom, he sat down and talked about what he expected of her, which he wouldn't buy into that discussion at all, but she just persisted with continuing to talk about it. And then she would ask him, well, what about helping you get up in the morning? Is that something I need to do for you, or can you do for yourself? And then he ultimately worked with her, and they agreed that one thing he couldn't do on his own was get out the door on time. And that was true because he was consistently making his family late for school. So in working with him, it was obvious that he had no idea how long it took him to do the various components of his daily activity. So we wrote down everything he needed to do, and he estimated how long he thought it took him to accomplish those tasks. And then he timed himself for 3 consecutive days. And it turned out it took him much longer than he anticipated. But the next step was to make a visual schedule that actually was time sensitive. Like he was to shower from like 7 o'clock to 7:10. And then brushing his teeth, a time was assigned. And he was open to following this visual schedule and felt like it really was helpful to have this reminder. And after doing this for a period of several months, he was able to just do it on his own. It became automatic for him. So that's an example of a scaffold, like a temporary support that's put in when they can't do something yet, but you feel like you can get him to the point where he can by providing a little assistance. So the next thing we're going to talk about is identifying and focusing on his strengths. And all of us have heard people talk about people with ADHD having a very unique skill set. And a lot of those things that people talk about happen to be characteristics of entrepreneurs. And we know that a large majority of entrepreneurs actually do have ADHD. But the things that come to mind are like being a big picture thinker rather than getting mired in the details, having high energy to be a multitasker, thriving on risk and being able to handle chaos, hyper-focusing on things of interest. To think about your son and what kind of strengths do you think he has? And it might be very reinforcing to him to read some of the biographies of people with ADHD, like David Neilman, the founder of JetBlue, who has a number of these characteristics and is running, a major airline now. So sometimes that's, very motivating to see, well, people did have some struggles, but they worked around them using their strengths, and now they're very successful. And another way to look at strengths is looking at Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And this is basically looking at strengths people have in particular areas like musical or linguistic or bodily kinesthetic, where you would be very athletic or very good at dancing, or visual spatial, where you're very good at building. So think about your son and see, which things you think would apply to him. In a book that I had written with another school psychologist on ADHD empowerment, we actually have a survey where people would, answer questions about their child to come up with what were their strengths. But this is a very critical thing in establishing his future success, is help him identify and focus on his strengths. And if you feel like you haven't quite found that yet, keep exposing him to things. And ultimately, he will find those kinds of strengths. Then after you have identified what those strengths are, you want to make sure that you are helping him shore up weaknesses that might interfere with him using those effectively. And usually these weaknesses fall under the area of the executive functions again, which we know are often weak in people with ADHD. And we've already talked a little bit about emotional regulation. Sometimes working memory is a significant weakness. And a lot of times the boys themselves can come up with their own strategies for helping them remember things that are important. Or organization, there's so many electronic tools now to assist with that. But think of one area that maybe you would like to pick to work on with your son, establish a partnership with him, figure out some reachable goals, because we know success breeds success. And as you're working on strengthening these areas, help him see when his effort has resulted in some progress. And as with anything, there are going to be ups and downs, but don't give up. Maybe you need to regroup, but appreciate the small steps you're making in shoring up these weaknesses. Another thing to think about is helping him figure out what leads to his successes and his missteps. So we've mentioned balanced life before, but that's really, really important. Does he have an understanding of his ADHD and how it affects him? And sometimes, as I mentioned, this is very empowering for boys to understand this. And think about when he's been successful and what contributed to that success. You might think if he's taking medication, you might consider that. Is he taking it as it's supposed to be administered? And is it the right medication, the right dosage? And the ultimate goal here is that he's going to believe that he can identify and work on what might be holding him back. So that's, a critical piece. So one of the boys I worked with realized that listening was what was holding him back, both in his functioning at home and at school. So we worked with him to observe when he listened best. Was it when he was engaged in an activity like holding a fidget or moving around? Was it a certain time of day? And he felt strongly that he was able to focus much more effectively in the morning. So the next term, his parent requested that his hard academic classes be scheduled in the morning when he felt like he was able to listen more effectively. And he felt he could listen better when he had something in his hand. So he used a fidget that wasn't distracting but helped him focus. And there actually is some research that suggests that boys with ADHD can listen more effectively when there's some kind of movement. We worked with him to recognize how important eye contact with his teacher was and how that would establishing that eye contact could help him pay attention. He learned to repeat the information as it was being presented quietly to himself as another way of remembering it and focusing his attention. And he figured out other ways to recall the message, like taking a brief shorthand note or a picture. If listening does involve doing, it's important to settle on a time when that task would be finished. So motivation is huge in changing any behavior. And again, it's an executive function, as we've noted before, and it's very impacted by his neurological functioning. It's like he knows what to do, but has difficulty translating that into action. So some keys to motivation are making sure he understands exactly what his responsibilities are and taking over those responsibilities, a road to self-confidence, because you're in essence saying, well, you're not capable, so I'm going to step in and do it for you. Identify why some activities are so rewarding and try to use elements of that in other tasks. Like one young man I worked with was very into Minecraft, and he liked giving tips to other players. So he and his father worked together on developing a site where he would actually earn money from providing access to more complex features on Minecraft. And so he learned a lot about record keeping, but he was also motivated because it was an interest area for him. And he ultimately ended up going into an IT program. Sometimes external motivation is needed, but these incentives are tricky for kids with ADHD because they need to be changed frequently in order to continue to be salient for them. But it doesn't have to be something monetary. It can even be choosing a family activity or where the family's going to go for an outing when we're allowed to go out again. But your hope is that this motivation will go from being external to internal, intrinsic motivation. And we've mentioned before how reinforcing it is when he realizes his efforts lead to good results and the importance of positive self-talk. And the last thing is to set a great example by showing good behavioral control and problem solving. But again, you're a human being dealing with a very complex time in his life, so you don't want to heap blame on yourself. But you just want to remember this and think about it because your son's watching and learning from your behavior. Sometimes it's helpful to actually talk to them about your choices and actions and how they are, impact your own sense of self-worth. Boys don't just automatically soak up those things. Sometimes it's important to have those conversations. So if you feel like there's, a family problem with behavioral control or problem solving, again, it can be a great bonding activity for everybody to sit down and think about it and decide their own way to approach it. So to sum up everything that we've talked about, in your goal to help your son get to be as independent and self-sufficient as possible, you want to have realistic expectations. You want to identify what he can't do from what he won't do and provide support to get more things in that can-do column. You want to identify his strengths and help him continue to develop those while shoring up any weaknesses that might interfere with his using those strengths. You want to help him identify conditions that lead to success and try to set him up for success when possible. And then you want to motivate him to change when that's required. So in closing, I particularly want to leave you with this top thought. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes courage is a quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I'll try again tomorrow. And that's what your son needs from you, that you are not going to give up, that you and he in partnership can figure out solutions to problems that pop up. So I've enjoyed talking to you about something that's so meaningful to me, and I hope I've given you some ideas that you might be able to use in helping your son be the best person that he can be. So now I'm very open to answering any questions, or at least trying to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thanks, Mary Ann. That was very good. One mom is asking, what if your son is completely apathetic, does not care about grades? Should I continue supporting him or should I let him fail?
Okay, so when a child is completely apathetic, it's really critical to try to dissect that and figure out what the root of that is. Like my personal opinion from working with children for over 30 years, if someone is apathetic, there's usually a reason for it. So sometimes it takes years to uncover it, but it's really important to figure out what is causing that. You have to look at, depression. Sometimes that can present as being apathetic. You have to make sure that he has the capability to do what's expected of him. You have to look at his interest. Is this totally outside his area of interest, and how might you engage him? Like if it's a school activity, for example, and he sees no purpose for it, sometimes if you can help him see how it might relate to something he might want to do in the future, or at least by doing this activity, he's not going to be closing doors for himself. It's just important to look at everything that's going on and, talk to his teachers. And is there any area of his life where he's not apathetic? And if you find that's the case, sort of dissect that and what is it about that opportunity that's motivating. Try to figure out what, he wants to work on. It's very complex, and sometimes you may need help, from a therapist or, a psychologist to try and figure it out. But just, don't give up. Keep looking for answers. And you can assist with activities, but you don't want to jump in and do them. So I hope that answers the question.
Several parents have asked if how they could be better friends with their teens. One mom mentioned that he doesn't want to spend any time with her at all. Another one says, in order to gain the trust, we should be friends. So what suggestions do you have that would facilitate that?
Okay, that is a touchy one. And sometimes I think the kids that push their parents away are the ones that actually need them the most. When I was a teacher, I used to think that some of the kids that are the most unlovable are the ones that need the most attention. I don't know if you can share in any activities that he likes. I know one father that I worked with had a son that really liked the thrill of a lot of activities. And so he would think of high interest, high energy activities like going out on an ATV or boating or fishing or rock climbing. And over the years, they were able to bond by, in doing those activities. I know some parents play video games, which is definitely not their forte, but they do that just so they can sort of learn the lingo and get on the wavelength of their son. And I'm sure that the parents have tried to talk to their kids and try to find an activity that maybe they could share. And a lot of kids are right in the moment during adolescence. They're not thinking about long term, but it's helpful to let your son know that, you won't always be there to be able to be with him and help him. So it's important to try to take advantage of those times, to try to find something that you can do together.
Yeah. You mentioned electronic tools for organization. Several parents have asked, do you have any suggestions there on that? Any tools you recommend?
Some specifics. Those are changing almost weekly. But there's a cozy family organizer that seems to work well for a lot of families, where everyone's schedule is online and they can look at it. That's one thing. A lot of kids use, the app, certain apps on their phone to keep up with their schedules. So that's, I can email them some specific suggestions, but, I don't really have any more definite things right on the, top of my head.
Okay.
But I know Attitudes had some great articles about technology.
Yes. Yeah, we do. We can share that with the group. A dad is interested primarily in the social aspects of ADHD for his teen boy. He says, my 16-year-old is starting to make a lot of comments about his lack of a social life, the fact that no one really talks to him, the fact that he doesn't really know how to carry on a conversation, often without starting to feel really awkward about it. Not sure how to help him. So do you have any recommendations for the social skills aspect?
And that's something that boys with ADHD do really often struggle with for many reasons. Sometimes they can't stay focused on the conversation long enough to figure out what's going on. Sometimes they jump in and blurt out things in the middle of a conversation because they know they have a weak memory and they're afraid they won't be able to remember what they wanted to say if they don't butt in and say it. So, by talking to your teen, maybe you can sort of dissect what it is he feels like he particularly has a problem with and, work on some of those skills. And it's important to, that like a lot of parents, are very cautious about what their kids are getting into, which you have to be these days. But you want to make sure, like, for example, with video games, that at least they are conversant about what's going on, and they have, they're able to talk to kids about it. If your son has a particular strength in an area, that could be a way for him to make friends, because there's already made, situation to talk about, like whether it's horseback riding or a sport or something like that. It's important to have interactions with other kids, but if you know that your son is weak in that area, then maybe setting up an opportunity for him to be with another kid that it's not totally open-ended. There's some structure, like going to a movie or bowling or something like that, where it's not totally on him to entertain the other boys. There's a lot of role-playing activities that you can do where, the father would present something to talk about and the son would have to, answer a give and take. There's a lot of curriculums for developing social skills for kids, teenagers even. And sometimes, a novel way of approaching social skills is by reading teen books with them and looking at how different teens have handled situations. And you can talk about that, like if someone, was excluded from a group, how the person in the book handled that and what would be some other options. So that's another way. And, there's therapists also that work specifically on social skills. But there's a lot of good material out there for parents on how to develop those skills.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Getting back to profanity and cursing, why do boys with ADHD have a problem with profanity? I don't know if you talked about, there was a lot of stuff there, the neurobiological underpinnings of that, but what in ADHD or the ADHD brain seems to increase its occurrence with boys?
Well, I think for any of us, when we use profanity, it's when we're extremely frustrated. So I think that, just for example, the school day, I think that is far more frustrating for a boy with ADHD than it would be for a boy without it, because not only does he have to learn the material, but he has to marshal his attention, which takes a lot of energy. So I think that the entire school day can be very frustrating, and they carry that around with them. And like I mentioned, with the activity, if they don't have an outlet for that, like a way to get rid of some of that, then it's going to constantly be bubbling up to the surface. And they, a lot of boys that I know with ADHD go from 0 to 60 in seconds. Like they go from being okay to being incredibly angry. And if they're accustomed to cursing, then that neurological pathway is going to have been developed in their brain, and it's almost going to be automatic. And, the culture today has so much cursing, like it's hard to watch something on TV that doesn't even have it. And a lot of teen boys that I've worked with really don't see a problem with it. So it's, incumbent on the parents, if, that they're not going to accept it, to be very clear about that. And, have, when a boy does curse, have some way for him to make up for doing that. Is he going to, think about it and ask in an appropriate way? How's that? Is the parent just going to walk away, and anytime he does that, there's going to be no chance of getting what he wants, but some way to cut that off, because it's such a habit. And if you have been around any middle or high schools and just walking in the halls, it's just so prolific. It's everywhere. So it's a definite part of the teen culture. And then the boys with ADHD don't have that neurological structure that allows them to think about what they're doing. They just automatically blurt out the first thing that comes to their mind, which unfortunately is often a curse word.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any suggestions when both the parent and the child have ADHD and struggle with emotional control?
Wow. Yes, that's
a tough one.
often a problem. Yeah, if they can have some open, respectful communication about that, where they both admit, well, yeah, this is something that is a problem for us, and it doesn't mean we don't love each other, but it means that controlling it is more difficult for us than it might be. And they have to think about and brainstorm ways that might work for their own family in how to manage that. Sometimes when parents who do have a diagnosis of ADHD share that with their sons, it makes a big difference in terms of how they go forward, because the boy sees that, well, yeah, my dad had these struggles, but he's managed to do just fine, and it can be reinforcing. But there's so much written now about adults with ADHD, and the anger management is a huge issue. And if they have the resources to go to therapy, sometimes that can be very helpful, because sometimes when both parties talk about the situation with an unbiased person, they sort of come to their own solutions about, well, hey, we should try this or we should do that. But that is definitely a thorny problem.
Right. And I think this one might have to be the last question. My son has so much potential but lacks confidence. How do I help him believe in himself to achieve his greatest potential? He literally talks himself out of doing things that I know he will be great at.
Sometimes the root of that is perfectionism. Like sometimes I've seen so many kids that won't attempt anything because they don't feel that they can do it perfectly. So rather than, make a stab at it and fail, they would rather not attempt it at all. And there's a lot of research about that that indicates that children that don't see an activity as a reflection of their intelligence, but just as an opportunity to try out their skill, are much more successful than someone who would be fearful, that people are going to think, well, I'm stupid if I try it and I fail. So, and encouraging him, it's called a mindset. There's a lot written about that. But it's important maybe, and there are even books for teens written about mindset. How you approach a task has a lot to do with your willingness to follow through. So that would be one avenue. And the other thing about confidence is, it's built with success after success. So trying to set up things where he attempts it and is successful will just reinforce his ability to keep trying. So that is, very important. And then not doing for him what he can do for himself, if that also undermines confidence. But the perfectionism is a very big thing to look into, because more than likely he doesn't want to do it unless he's sure he can do it perfectly. So you have to almost reinforce mistakes. Like every time he tries something and he's not successful, let him know that that was a great effort that he made. So,
Okay.
That's
Okay. Okay, that was great. I think the hour is up. Marianne, I appreciate you being here. You did a great job with the presentation and gave us lots of strategies. So once again, thank you.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure. And I, love the work that Attitude Magazine does. I think you are such a positive force in the whole field of ADHD, and probably have changed so many lives by what you are doing.
Well, that's nice to hear. We try. And thank you again for being here, and thanks to all of the attendees for listening in. Please join us actually this Thursday, April 30th, in 2 days, when Michelle Novotny will talk about reassessing goals and priorities after a pandemic. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and have a great day.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.